Sure. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Munro Live. I'm Kevin Hardy. Today we're going to talk about the 2023 Lexus RZ, the Z being zero emission versus the RX series, at least within operation of the vehicle itself. And we're going to go through some of the chassis components that weren't talked about with its sister vehicle, the Toyota BZ4X and the Subaru Solterra, which share the current iteration of the e-TNGA, which is Toyota new global architecture. Since TNGA came out, I want to say about 5 or 6 years ago, if I remember off the top of my head. Don't quote me on that though. But we'll kind of make our way, under the vehicle itself. This doesn't have all the aero shields pulled off. It's pretty dirty under here, I think, from Corey's Road. But one of the first things that you kind of see that's different between this vehicle and at least the Toyota that we have is the Toyota had essentially a stamped beam that went across the front of the vehicle here for its lower impact beam itself. This was extruded on the other vehicle as well, but it's just kind of interesting that on a more premium or performance-oriented and luxury vehicle, you're seeing some slight changes in material choices. Obviously, we're not sure if there's like a rolling change, either to steel or from steel. We'd have to see essentially very similar build configurations of both vehicles, but that's one thing that I noticed that was not on the Toyota that is present on the Lexus. But most of the other stuff looks pretty similar as we work our way back. So we have essentially a relatively large lower crush can here that helps drive energy into the cradle itself. Both the cradle and the motor bay rails themselves are splayed, and you can kind of see here it kind of picks up some supports for the cooling system itself. One thing that's interesting here, I know we talked a lot about the brackets that Toyota uses, and they love brackets, love small stampings. It helps with capital investment costs and things of that nature. But we essentially have like a service provision here with 2 fasteners for this cooling module. And one thing that's interesting, and Jordan touched on it a little bit with this vehicle, is on the body side, there's a large steel member that goes across. And I'll try and showcase a couple of things with respect to that. But if you want to pull in here and then look straight up here, Eric, you'll see it. So now, this is a bolt-in structure that goes through paint and e-coat drip, all that stuff together. So it is fastened and then goes through essentially paint and final line assembly, just like it is. And then, but that insinuates that essentially this has a closed front-end architecture, which is interesting. This is something that we saw a lot in older vehicles themselves. But I would say within the last 20 years or so, we really haven't seen a ton of unibody cars that kind of execute the strategy still. So of the EVs that we have in the building, we have our Model 3, the 2 Model Ys, the Model S, the Mach-E, and the Ioniq 5 as far as our unibody passenger vehicles. All of them have open front-end architectures, which allow essentially whatever cooling module you're doing to be brought into the vehicle itself and then fastened on essentially this initial impact plane where you have crush cans and a lot of your low-speed damageability and cooling module components themselves. But it's kind of interesting that this is going vertically, so it maybe suggests that this is being built up and essentially all the EDM, the whole front cradle is being loaded vertically into the vehicle. What you don't see on the top of this, we can kind of come around and take a look, but we have an off fascia AGS system. So as you kind of come around here, you'll see the vanes themselves. This does help with some styling cues, especially if you're trying to bring some like ice elements of like some of those grille styling features and retain some of that versus a on fascia AGS cooling strategy, which we're seeing on a lot of vehicles there and helps a lot with aero counts and efficiency themselves. While it does kind of bifurcate the responsibility of where those components lay, this helps, like I mentioned kind of before, probably with getting it decked, all with the cradle, all that stuff coming up as one piece. There's some trade-offs there as far as complexity with the fascia and what system burdens that, and then what makes sense for the overall vehicle itself. But we are seeing a trend of going to on fascia AGS themselves through a lot of the newer EVs. But that's one thing that I thought was kind of interesting, was that cross member themselves that runs across. The Lightning, which is obviously a body on frame EV, and the body itself is essentially carryover from the ICE platform, and the Rivian R1T and R1S itself, again, body on frame, do have a small member that goes across from there, but that's something interesting with at least TNGA, or e-TNGA, excuse me, that we're seeing some of the closed-end architecture elements brought back with an EV specifically. As we kind of work our way rearward, let me move here on the vehicle. Sorry if I sound a little nasally. I don't have any allergy medicine, so it's been a little rough here the last couple of days. Again, we have essentially large cradle points here that run up to the stanchion, here with the body structure itself. Again, splayed motor bay rails for Sorb. I know Jordan talked a lot about this, beforehand, but from what I can see here, they have essentially a pretty good balance between offensive and defensive strategies themselves. Not a lot of material back here on the rear side of the vehicle wheel well itself. We do have a lot of the splaying and the reinforcement of the gussets and the front end architecture itself. There's nothing wrong with that. It really depends on how you're trying to manage, your impact trip, the energy, and things just throughout the overall event itself. As we kind of pointed out with a lot of the Hyundai Kia vehicles, they did not have a lot of the front end reinforcement for small overlap rigid barrier, and they were able to get away with a very defensive strategy where essentially the passenger cell of the vehicle itself was able to bear the brunt of that. But here recently they've had to incorporate a lot of the Sorb countermeasures in the more offensive realm, being essentially trying to get the vehicle off the barrier or engage primary load structure of both the suspension system and the body white structure early in the event to get it off the barrier, versus relying essentially the barrier kind of coming through here, working its way through, and then relying on the passenger cell to stop any further intrusion, because that's really what Sorb kind of comes down to, is managing the energy to the occupants themselves and any intrusion into the occupant space itself, whether it be footwell or A-pillars or anything like that, kind of intruding into the occupant space. As we kind of move rearward here, we have the front EDM. If I remember correctly, both of these are permanent magnet motors. This is a front bias system, so I think it's roughly 200 horsepower and I think like 196 foot-pounds of torque. And then the rear is I think 106 and then 124 foot-pounds of torque. But this is, as we kind of talked about, relatively conventional. You're seeing essentially stamped steel clamshell design implemented throughout all this, as it kind of comes back and splays outward, coming into the rear of the cradle. The cradle itself actually dips below and comes up and then interfaces with the body. I'm not sure if we can get that, Eric, but you kind of see it, I think, right in here. And then you essentially have these doubler plates that then go from the rear portion of the cradle into the battery skid plate assembly itself. I would agree. I think there's a lot of free crush space, management being done here to try and prevent any intrusion into the forward aspects of the battery. And when you look at just what Toyota has done here, as far as layering this and protecting essentially where the connectors are, and even with the leading edge of the cradle here, dipping down in this stamping to protect the drive module itself, clearly just some thought of how to protect your really high dollar, monuments within the vehicle itself. One of the things that's kind of interesting is, and we don't have those covers, I apologize, but there's essentially a series of steel cross members that are part of a steel substrate within this, and you might be able to see it from the side, Eric. So essentially you have a very simple stamped aluminum outer shield, and then you have these steel collars, and then essentially a steel kind of corrugated structure that works its way across as well. And then this kind of doubler plate tees into that and then helps whatever energy is coming, both protecting the leading edge of the pack, but it also might help and distribute some of that energy into essentially the exterior surface of the battery itself, the skid plates, I should say, versus the actual battery structure, which would be interesting. Without, obviously see crash scripts or anything like that, I'm not sure, which is kind of a thought here. But as you kind of go and look down the overall rocker of the vehicle, one thing that's a little bit different, as you can see here, that structure kind of picks up here. So you have essentially, I don't know, maybe close to like a 300 millimeter gap from the outboard side of where the body structure would be here inboard to the vehicle itself. Now this vehicle is equipped with a 71.4, I think, kilowatt hour battery pack itself. Obviously, a lot of people have talked about the range. It's not stellar. It's comparable to the Model Y or the Mach-E as far as overall vehicle segment, but this is only kind of coming in at 220 miles really with range, and this has the 20, so this is only 196 or so in ideal conditions. But it'd be interesting seeing. We've never torn down a TNG e-TNGA vehicle itself, just the ICE architectures themselves, of like what type of compromises may be involved. Essentially, the packaging of both the battery structure, which is essentially a large multi-cell extrusion that's reaching out here, and then the rockers from the body itself. One of the things you are seeing is the cladding, also the cladding here on the door itself. Very common from an exterior perspective. Not the intent of this video, but it's a personal pet peeve of mine of exterior cladding on doors. Just adds complexity. They're expensive tools. Paint operations just a little wasteful in my mind, but I understand why they exist. As we kind of come rearward with the vehicle itself, we come to the rear chassis. So essentially we have a multi-link, swing blade, gosh, can't talk today. Twist blade, thank you. Assembly here. Much like the front being stamped steel, there's nothing really wrong with stamped steel. It's cost effective. It's strong, and frankly, we're seeing now lots of trade-offs happening with our customers with respect to getting the cost out of EVs, as both a lot of the weight from the battery structure of the battery pack itself is brought into the vehicle, and it causes essentially a series of challenges for the overall vehicle's weight and both crash and just other performances characteristics as well. We're seeing a lot of customers that maybe were in aluminum for one component, maybe migrating back to steel, just because essentially as they run through their development cycles, they just end up adding more and more aluminum, and they start to get to this point where not only is the cost from a material perspective and that manufacturing process, whether it's cast or extruded and stamped, gets to be expensive, but it might bring essentially a steel control arm that is maybe only slightly heavier back into the fold from like a bill of materials perspective, to be very, very inexpensive and really help the overall vehicle as far as the cost to the OE be a little bit more bearable. This vehicle itself is a luxury vehicle, being a Lexus, and helps and has some margin there to kind of work with, but overall with the battery packs and things of that nature, none of this is new information, but it's still a struggle as some of the legacy OEs are shifting to adopt these EV architectures within their portfolios themselves, while not also essentially changing every aspect of their design guidelines and things of that nature, which is why essentially you see a very similar strategy across all of the Toyotas that we've kind of seen here. There's really not a good reason to change it, and it's very cost effective. Most of these strategies, from both being stamped, it's just clamshelled, again, a very simple upper camber arm here. This doesn't even look like it's stamped. It's just essentially a very simple, probably forming stamping, and then a weldment itself, so very low capital investment. A lot of these strategies can be replicated all throughout the world once the e-TNGA architecture truly goes global. You don't have some essentially the same supplier constraints that you might have going to different markets that you might have versus like Japan or coming to the US or things of that nature, where you have a lot of capability from a manufacturing perspective, excuse me, but bringing that architecture elsewhere in the world, you might have to change parts and their overall design pretty drastically. So this is the rear EDM itself. Again, it's permanent magnet, much smaller as it's a front-wheel drive bias system. But overall, it is relatively conventional. You want to talk about so this is a very simple kind of injection molded NVH shield here, and then you can see essentially, I don't know if it's glued on, but I think it's just a sandwiched PUR foam here. One thing I do like about it is it's very localized. You don't see it necessarily wrapped around the entire vehicle. There might be one on top where the inverter is, because there's a lot of noise associated essentially with the high voltage inverters. But overall, it's relatively efficient, I would say, from a vehicle perspective. The one thing that's interesting, not to go back to the front of the vehicle, but this vehicle itself is not equipped with the drive-by-wire setup. So this has a very conventional or conventional steering system. And the one thing I kind of wanted to point out is there's a large motor on this side, essentially your steering input on the driver's side, obviously. But one of the challenges oftentimes, especially in this kind of global environment, is packaging for left and right-hand drive. Like for some of our customers, the amount of compromises that are brought into a platform that due to right-hand drive configurations, which is it's essentially just a few markets within the world, is pretty noteworthy. So while the drive-by-wire system itself may not have a ton of performance benefits to your kind of average customer, from an architecture perspective, I think it's actually pretty interesting to try and help and eliminate essentially large packaging claims which may exist within the front end of the module, front end of the vehicle, and this overall module that they do have in package with the cradle, the EDMs, and essentially your supplementary high voltage components that are kind of stacked above this, with this particular vehicle at least. But that's something that, while this one didn't have it, I'd like to see in the future to kind of see how it packages. And I do suspect we'll see more of that kind of going forward. You know, Tesla's kind of already announced that some of their vehicles are not building right-hand drive configurations anymore. And frankly, there's not a ton of volume. I'm sure all the Australians and New Zealanders and the British and the Japanese are kind of screaming. But like the fact that there's so many concessions made for those markets, it's pretty interesting to see at the very early level with some of our customers and dealing with especially EVs and what compromises they end up having to make from an architecture perspective to facilitate a driving column and system on the right-hand side of the vehicle, where I think the drive-by-wire might be a good interim setup, essentially where you leave that complexity aft of the dash panel, mostly in your IP components and the actual steering column themselves and the steering wheel, where as it passes through the dash panel, hopefully you can get to a fact where you truly have global components from steering and chassis considerations, you know, moving forward. So I was hoping this would have it. It didn't, but that's okay. So thanks again for kind of tuning in to look at the Lexus RZE. Not too much different from essentially the other vehicles on the e-TNGA platform, but some subtle changes. But overall, we appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in and giving us the opportunity to kind of talk about this. Thank you.